Daryl Morey has absolutely crushed the Sixers offseason, bringing in Paul George and a number of other impact players. However, he teased the opportunity of adding Lauri Markkanen may have been on the table and that the Sixers were in the mix. While coming away with Paul George is nothing to sneeze at, I do want to break down what went down, what he said about Lauri Markkanen, why we're kind of theorizing that this is Lauri, as Daryl cannot obviously go and outright say that himself, and everything else we know on the situation, as well as if this could come into play again. Now, I want to start off with the initial quote here that Daryl Morey joined the Rights to Ricky Sanchez podcast, where he did discuss a little bit about the offseason as a whole, and one of the quotes that grabbed a lot of attention was, he was asked specifically about the draft picks and their intentions on using them, and then his reply was, quote, "So there was a trade soon after Paul came where we would have had to give up quite a few of those picks. Our payroll would have been $315 million next season, but ultimately it did not come together." So a lot of people are theorizing that this could be Lauri Markkanen, and for good reason. That he's been the biggest fish of this NBA offseason, kind of the last turning point or big key figure, the domino to fall that could impact the overall landscape of the league. And for good reason. Now we know that he is kind of hanging out there in Utah on a team that has not decided the direction that he would go, and I do not want it to get lost just how talented that Lauri Markkanen is. So just to dive into the stats for this season, 23.2 points per game, 8.2 rebounds, 2 assists, shot the ball incredibly well, 48% from the field, 39.9% from three, a real deal 7-footer, shots 43.6% from the corner. He is truly a player that can do it all, that he can come off screens, he can come off pin downs, he can put the ball on the floor and create. He was also third in the league in dunks, which is just crazy stuff when you think about like how many high flyers there are. But at 7 feet, the ability to attack a closeout, and just at worst being a true floor spacer, he truly is a player that I think is going underrated, and I think that's why the conversation is so steep in terms of draft picks. And that has been the beauty of the spot where the Sixers are in. We've talked a lot on this channel about that KJ Martin balloon deal, and it was for this type of role, that contract can be attached to the draft picks that they maintain, which is one of the hugest reasons why it was massive that Paul George elected to just sign in free agency, as you did not have to give up a single thing there. But I did want to speak a little bit about Lauri. Now, with the Sixers overall, it is conceivable that you could have potentially added Lauri Markkanen to this team. And I did want to dive into some of the details. Shout out to Derek Barnard of PHLY Sports, who did a little breakdown here. Is it likely? No. But is it possible? Yes. And he starts out with, first and foremost, the Sixers would have to, number one, outbid the market for Markkanen, which may not be possible, and two, offer enough that Danny Ainge would say yes, which also may not be possible. And honestly, in my heart of hearts, what I feel right now is either the Jazz end up holding on to him and building around him, which I think there's plenty of reason why, or a team like the Oklahoma City Thunder dive into their seemingly endless collection of draft picks and outbid what the Sixers could fully offer. But why this works for Lauri Markkanen, and you can see a little breakdown for the contract, is because of what a cheap deal he is, and specifically what the deal is for the season. He's making $18 million, which for a guy of his talent, who's a guy that has been an all-star and will continue to be for the foreseeable future, that's an incredibly just bargain contract there. Now, for the Sixers, where this comes into play, that $18 million figure basically makes it possible for this season, but then you have some trouble when the extension would come in. This is where Daryl hints at the $315 million payroll, and this is why it would have been a big swing, but in my mind, why not at this point? If you can find a way to actually bring him in, there is no doubt in my mind that that should absolutely be the case. And to add a little bit about what he brings to the table here, did want to pull up these. Shout out to Mr. Crockpot of Edge of Philly Sports here. He says Sixers trade target Lauri Markkanen, and this was tweeted at the point where there was no knowledge of Paul George, so this was kind of looked at as another avenue they could potentially go down. But 27 years old, shot 37.3% from three, the 82nd percentile in pick and roll last season. Again, I don't think Lauri probably becomes available or is a true option for the Sixers, but the fact that if there were those type of conversations, to me is really intriguing, and just is once again a testament to Daryl Morey for the way that he continues to break down every single option. And for this Sixers team, it's clear why it would work. But to dive into what the depth chart would look like, you can see the one weakness on this Sixers team is at that power forward position. And we've talked pretty in-depth about there. Now, frankly, what I like about Lauri, and I feel the same way about Paul George in this type of thing, is they're guys that can both be high-impact players with the right opportunity or with enough on their plate. And they're also not going to hurt you if they have to take a little bit of a sideline. If Joel Embiid has it going for a night and wants to continue to be the offensive hub. If Tyrese Maxey is having one of his nights where he needs the ball in his hands a lot. Both these guys are about as good as it gets as spot-up shooters, and Lauri Markkanen especially the case. And having a true 7-footer that I think you could run like lineups with him as the center in the non-Joel Embiid minutes would be incredibly appealing to me as well. And again, this is the pipe dream. This is the ideal situation. But if you want to think about a starting five along the lines of Tyrese Maxey, Paul George, Lauri Markkanen, Caleb Martin, and Joel Embiid, it does not get much better than that. That I think they would be the certified championship favorites. That's even including the Boston Celtics in that conversation there. I know they wear the crown right now, but I think that team would straight up be better, and I love the matchup. When we're starting to talk about Lauri Markkanen, Kristaps Porzingis, that for my money's worth, I'm taking Lauri in that debate, and it's as clean of a matchup as you're looking. That you're not stretching Joel Embiid out to the perimeter, all these types of conversations. Paul George right in that same tier of mix. Of course, Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown better at this point in each of their careers, but he is a guy that stylistically can match up and is going to compete on the defensive end with those guys, which we have not seen in years past. But the bottom line is, this is still a little bit of a pipe dream. Now, shout out to my guy, Chill Bro Dude of the You Know Ball podcast. He's always thinking a little bit differently, and I did love his take on this, that he did dive into a little bit of a different mindset here. And what he said specifically is, my conspiracy theory was that it was Jonathan Kuminga for a few reasons. This speaking about the Morey quote here. He says, any player that the Sixers could trade for would need to make less than $10 million since it was after the Paul George. Other deals like Drummond and Oubre were already announced. The player would need to be up for a big contract, but not a full max extension. This would bring the payroll and tax to $300 million next year, like Morey mentioned on the podcast, which fits Kuminga. The Warriors were linked to Lauri, but the Jazz didn't want Kuminga. They wanted Pochevsky, who the Warriors aren't willing to trade. They would need a third team that takes on Kuminga for picks, and they could trade him into the Sixers cap space since his deal is under $10 million. Once the trade fell through, they used the remaining cap space to sign Caleb Martin instead. And the kicker, KJ Martin signed for $7.9 million this year, and Kuminga makes $7.6 million. So if they ever revisit it, whether the Warriors just don't want to pay Kuminga, or there's a bigger three-team trade where the Warriors get back a star, they still can make a trade with that pick. So a lot to break down here, and I do love that Trill using his outside-the-box brain as he tends to do. To kind of touch on this specifically, the timing of this very much matters to the context, and Morey did not give that away, and nor should he, to be perfectly honest there. But I do think it is worth noting that that would have been a home run swing to me too, a guy like Jonathan Kuminga, and to dive into what he brings to the table here from a statistical standpoint, we're talking about 16.1 points per game, 4.8 rebounds, 2.2 assists, not the best shooter at 32.1% from three, 52.9% from the field, but still just 21 years old, 6'8". He is a guy that I do think could fit that power forward type mold, and I do think he's growing into a guy that could be like a high-level wing. I was really high on him coming out of his lone year in the G League, a G League Ignite product there. It has not fully played out, but he's been in kind of a tough space, and I thought last year he took some real strides forward in his game. I'm very curious to see what he looks like this season, but that is the type of player that I think would be worth taking a gamble on from the Sixers' perspective. And the other name that I have seen brought up as kind of a speculation, if it was not Lauri, has been Trey Murphy. And to talk about Trey Murphy a little bit specifically, for starters, I do think it's a little relevant that Murphy went on the podcast, which, by the way, Tyrese Maxey just went on recently, immediately following the news that he did sign with the Sixers, so a little bit of that connecting there. And when you do dive into the finances, it works as well. And Murphy's another guy who I think would be an absolutely seamless fit. And to dive into what he brings to the table, just last season, 14.8 points per game, 4.9 rebounds, and 2.2 assists, shot 38% from three and 44.3% from the field. Still another guy that is young and upcoming at 24 years old, 6'8", shot 40.4% from the corner, and that's a little bit of a down year for him as a shooter. Now, my speculation on this being the case is me reading the tea leaves. Feels like the Brandon Ingram being pushed out of New Orleans had more to do with wanting to pave the lane for Trey Murphy than anything. So I'd be surprised if they're making that type of decision. But the Ingram's probably the only other name that you kind of to keep an eye on at this point. Ultimately, I don't see them moving on from Trey Murphy. I do think the Kuminga and Lauri Markkanen conversations are much more frequent. And I think it probably, to be perfectly honest, had to do with Morey being in those exact talks and trying to figure out, okay, well, we want to be in the mix here. We want to get something good out of this trade that ultimately seems like it's going to be going down, that there has been a lot of Golden State and Utah conversations. And it makes sense from a Golden State perspective to add him to Steph Curry, how elite of a duo that would be. And I can see Lauri fitting in that Warriors system quite well. So I understand the talks there. And I think Daryl absolutely would have snaked Golden State and brought in Lauri if it was a possibility. But ultimately, the offseason is not over, so we'll see how things play out from here. So shout out to Daryl for continuing to work the margins, call every team, and leaving no stone unturned. This Sixers team is the most talented that I've seen in my lifetime, and I think is ready to contend for a championship right now. but I would not say no to adding another key piece, absolutely. And by the way, still 2 remaining roster spots. Daryl has indicated 1 will remain open, so at least 1 new player will be added to the Sixers team. So stay tuned for that, as we will have some more news to break down soon. Appreciate each and every one of you guys for tuning into this video here. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. What an ideal fit Lauri Markkanen would be, and are you with me? That would absolutely make the Sixers a championship favorite. Let me know below. Make sure you're smashing that subscribe button if you have not already. Dropping a like on this video, and I'll talk to you next time. Peace.